So welcome to Botany Basics. My name is Margot Rollins, and I am the program coordinator for the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve for the Center for Environmental Inquiry. And we are based at Sonoma State University, which I'm sure most of you know. And this program is part of our Fall Dig into Nature series. This is the first part of a two-part program that we've put together called, we're just calling it our Botanical series. The second part is on the 28th of October. And that, by the way, is fully subscribed at the moment. But if you are interested in that, it's a field day that we'll be doing at the Osborne Preserve on Sonoma Mountain. And if you're interested in that, you should all have my email address. And if you don't, it's on the cei.sonoma.edu calendar webpage, so that you can let me know if you're interested in going in on the wait list. Let me just take just a minute to tell you a little bit about the Center for Environmental Inquiry. Our objective is to help people at both the students, faculty, and other members of the university, as well as the community at large, gain the skills to address and solve the most challenging environmental issues in Northern California. And we do that in a variety of ways through outdoor learning experiences on our three preserves. And sorry, take me a minute to, maybe if you could let people in, thanks, Wendy, while I'm finishing up the quick intro. We do outdoor experiences on our three preserves. One of them is the one that I'm involved in, which is in Mendocino County, and the other two are right near campus in Sonoma County. Then we provide classes and workshops, and the preserves are open for anyone who is interested in anything to do with education or the environment and inquiry in general. And you'll find on our website there are applications for permission to come onto the preserve, and they're quite simple. Fill those in and we'll let you know whether this is going to work or not. We welcome everyone to enjoy that. We also invest in real world projects with our students primarily and members of the larger community to address these issues. And particularly we focus on water, fire, technology, and other things that have to do with our particular needs here in this area. Today, our presenter is Wendy St. John. Wendy is faculty with both biology and the geography, environment, and planning departments at Sonoma State University. And she's going to be talking to us about plant illustration. She has become passionate about that. And you will see, as you can already see, well, this is her drawing here on her lead slide. She's also become very skilled at doing this. And before we start, though, I would ask you all if you wouldn't mind put your names in the chat and let us know where you're calling from, just so we get an idea of who's out there in the audience. If you have clarifying questions, put them in the chat as we go along. We have set aside time from after Wendy's presentation in which we will be allowed, you can ask questions directly or through the chat, whatever you're most comfortable with. Wendy's very flexible and happy to answer them however you wish to ask them. But during the presentation, we're going to ask that you remain muted and put your questions in the chat. And if it's something that really needs to be asked right then, I will keep an eye on it and ask for those questions. And we are recording it. I will be sending you the link to the recording after the program is over. It'll be probably several days by the time we clean up the beginning and the end of it. And I also will be sending you some things that Wendy would like you to have for references. So with that, welcome all of you again. And Wendy, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Margot. And thank all of you for being here today. I'm really excited about being able to give this presentation. So this is, as Margot said, we're going to look at some plant identification and illustration. So I'm just going to jump right on into it. Clicky click. There we go. So overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about what is botanical illustration, because there's a couple of different things that term can kind of encompass, and we're going to do some clarifying of that. Then we're going to talk about plants. We're going to do a very brief dip our toe into plant taxonomy. And then what we're really going to focus on is the characteristics of plants that we would want to be paying attention to in order to be able to identify those plants. And then we're going to do a little bit of a kind of an intro to getting started with botanical drawing. And this is a very basic drawing lesson. So for people who have no experience with artwork, this is a way that I've done this with a lot of my students, and I've had some really like amazing artists come out of my classes afterwards, which is really rewarding. And if we have time, I don't know if we will, but if we have time, I'm then going to go through some of the specific families of plants, some things that are really common here in our riparian areas. That's some habitat that's alongside of a stream here in California. So we will go a little bit more deeply into the plant taxonomy stuff if we have time at the end. So okay, botanical illustration. I really like this quote. This is a quote from Rosemary Wise, who's a botanical illustrator with the Oxford Botanical Garden. And she says, the aim is to produce not only a picture that is pleasing to the eye, but one which is botanically accurate, comprehensive, and recognizable to species level. Such works broach the gap between art and science. And so when we're thinking about, and what we can see pictured here, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out what to do with my windows of everyone's faces. Okay, there we go. What we can see pictured here, right? This is a dandelion, a flower that's probably familiar to all of us. And we've got a photograph on the left, and then three different illustrative treatments of that flower. So when we're thinking about the kind of drawing we're going to talk about today, the emphasis is going to be on science rather than just visual art. Now, I completely agree with Rosemary in that this is a picture that's pleasing to the eye. I care very much about the aesthetics of the artwork that I do, but there's also a focus on making it a true and lifelike representation of a plant. Ideally, it's going to highlight the plant's distinguishing features so that someone could look at an illustration and be able to identify that plant to the species, and demonstrating an understanding of plant morphology. So we are going to talk a little bit about plant morphology today. This is a super intro class, so it's going to be at a pretty basic level, but it should get us a start of kind of what sort of things to look at in plants in order to start being able to identify them. So there's when we think about illustrations of plants, there's a pretty wide spectrum of what people do. The first level is something we might just consider flower painting or doing a plant portrait, like this portrait of some plants by somebody, a little guy you might have heard of named Vincent van Gogh, right? We then have, and so when we're thinking about this is not a botanical illustration, not the kind of scientific thing that we're going to look at today. We have a lot of people painting things that are, the emphasis is on a pleasing composition, right? Rather than accuracy or really trying to capture the actual colors or features of the plant. Things like still lifes where we have plants in vases, or, images of gardens or countrysides. These can be a lot more impressionistic and may not be true to life. Now, if this is the kind of painting that you end up converging on, that's great, right? There's absolutely nothing wrong with this kind of work. And there are things that we can do if we're really wanting to approach a more scientific focus. This, by the way, is the bear and some lupin. That's part of a larger work that I drew. But it's kind of the plant in it. The plant isn't really the focus. It doesn't have the details of a lupin that would maybe let somebody look at that and go, oh, I know for sure what species of lupin that is, right? It's kind of has a different purpose. And the next level is something that we might call just botanical art. This is artwork that is intended to be scientifically and botanically correct, although maybe not complete. Like this red flowering currant here that I painted, it's got, it shows what the leaves look like, what the inflorescence looks like, what the berries look like, but it doesn't show seeds. It doesn't show a lot of different aspects of lifestyle. There's no detail of the ovary of the flowers, things like that. So this would not reach the level of botanic illustration, but again, that's fine. Right here, the emphasis is on aesthetics without the requirement for all of that information that would be desired in a botanical illustration. These are often done in color on a plain background, although they can also involve records of the habitat that the plant grows in naturally. In this case, I've added, another species to this. So we're looking at the Horikama butterfly, which often lives on red flowering currant. And this is something that could definitely contribute to a flora, which is a collection of illustrations and information about all or as many as possible of the plant life that exists in particular location. Like you might have a flora for a garden. In fact, one of the resources that Margot is going to send to you is a flora of Copeland Creek on the Sonoma State campus. And that's a collection of, in this case, photographs of a lot of the plants that we have on campus. So botanical art, I would say that this particular class is kind of geared at this, and then maybe sort of stepping into the next level of botanic illustration. But wherever you fall and feel comfortable with the level of detail that you want to do in your artwork is totally fine. So when we think about botanical illustration itself, it really, the reality of what we as humans do is that we tend to do things that we find important. And that's going to be true with artwork, right? People tend to draw things that they find important. So throughout most of history, there's been more of a focus on doing illustrations of humans and animals. But at some point, we started to recognize that plants do have a lot of importance, in particularly in their medicinal value. So a lot of the earlier illustrations, like this is from a botanical garden in ancient Egypt, it's about 1500 years BCE, then when this was created. We have other things from this is from a 6th century manuscript, where what we're looking at are people wanting to put down the details of plants that have medicinal value in a way that other people could look at them and say, oh, hey, I can go find that plant and here's what it's good for. And then as we move through history, we're going to find like this is something from the 16th century, I think, right here. This is a really lovely example of a botanical illustration that was part of a flora. It was commissioned as part of, there was a botanist who was asked to illustrate every single plant in this person's garden. It took 16 years, but that was part of that. Then we're going to come to what we call the golden century of botanical artwork, not just botanical, really natural history illustration in general, where we see these great strides between 1750 and 1850 in people just getting in and doing things that are the realism, the level of realism and detail is really going to take off during this period. This is a portrait from that period, this rose, and you can really see just lovely detail, lovely. The colors are meant to be accurate. It's showing like various kinds of, it's looking, you see some buds and some opening flowers and a fully open flower and things like that. So we really see this realm of naturalistic illustration come into like kind of its own in that century. And then we also have a lot of contemporary people doing botanical artwork, right? And sometimes now some of the things we see as we start to see maybe illustrations that are focusing a little bit more on unusual life cycles, like maybe plants that are past their prime, where we're seeing a wilted flower or something that's starting to decompose. And, the other thing about this kind of artwork is sometimes it's going to give us a record of something that may not be there anymore. This is a painting of a particular orchid that lives in only a few locations. This portrait was done by someone who went to the Andes Mountains, to the cloud forest to document it. And the population of plants that she used to do this portrait are now no longer there. That area has been developed. And so this is a species that's highly endangered and may actually be lost, but we do have a record of it here in the form of this illustration. So when we think about something that would rise to the level of botanical illustration, there's going to be an emphasis on accuracy. Ideally, somebody would be able to use this drawing, recognize the species, and use that drawing as a way of helping to identify plants in the wild as to being a member of that species or not, right? And it's also going to create a scientific record. Ideally, they're being drawn from live plants or from herbarium specimens. And again, ideally, they would want to depict all of the relevant aspects of the life cycle of the plant, right? So here we can see leaves, both the front and the back, or the arboreal side of the leaf. And then we can see, the root structures. We've got a little cut open of, this is probably like and this is it looks like a fern. So that's going to be some of the reproductive structures that have been, there's a detail on that. So really having a lot of detail is ideal. And historically, traditionally, botanical illustrations were usually done in monochrome, right? This is really just an outline, sort of a contour drawing without huge amounts of with some shading, but no color. Because in the past, it was a lot more expensive to print things in color. That is starting to change now that there's a lot more digital artwork that happens. For example, I do all of my artwork digitally. I basically do only digital artwork, unless I'm sitting somewhere and I want to doodle and I grab a pen and a napkin. But so we're starting to open up to the ability to do more things in color now. But traditionally, we would have often seen these as monochrome. Here's just another couple of examples of some botanical illustrations. We can see here again, this one is in color, showing a flower in sort of various stages of openness. We've got the seed. We've got some looking at how the roots are coming off of this stem. And so we can just see a really nice view of a lot of different parts of the life cycle. This is a little bit of a different approach. This is a collection of different seed pods of tropical plants. So another way, but we can see they're very detailed. You can look at these and recognize what they are. And this could be a guide in helping to identify them in the wild, in the field. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and now start looking at plants and some of the structures and the characteristics of plants that are going to help us to identify them in the field. Because ideally, that's really what we want to be able to do. It may not always be possible and we'll talk about this, it may not always be possible for us to identify a particular plant to its species, but maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe we can get it to, within its genus or its family, and that's going to be good enough for our purposes at the time. But when we think about the taxonomy of plants, there are going to be 4 major groups of plants, and they're shown here on this. And also, modern green algae is shown here, but guess what? That's not considered a plant anymore. Algae is now considered in a different group. It's considered a part of they're considered protists. So we're going to ignore that algae is there. And are the first group of plants that evolved is going to be the seedless non-vascular plants. So they do not have seeds. They also don't have any vascular tissues. So mosses had to remain very small and they needed to be growing right near a water source because they don't have a way to transport nutrients and water through their tissue. So they're doing everything by osmosis. Seedless non-vascular plants, if you want just one word to help you remember, the mosses is a good way to think about this, but it's going to include things like the true mosses, liverworts. So earliest kind of plants that are very much like what the early evolution of plants would have looked like. The next group we're going to have are the seedless vascular plants, in particular ferns. Ferns are the largest group of seedless vascular plants. These are still also going to be plants that do not have seeds. They're going to use spores for reproduction, but now they do have vascular tissues, xylem and phloem, that are going to be allowing nutrients and water to be transported through the tissues of the plant. That's going to be a game changer for plants because it's going to allow them to start to grow a lot bigger because now they have a way to move things through their tissues. And so instead of being small and living next to the water, you can start to get bigger and start to move away from that being right next to a source of water. So the seedless vascular plants, pretty important evolutionary step. The next group we're going to get are the seeded plants, and there are 2 groups of seeded plants. First, there are the gymnosperms. We could think of conifers are going to be the bulk of the gymnosperms, or what we would think of as conifers or cone bearing. Think Christmas tree, right? An evergreen tree. And the fact that these have seeds is going to make them more adapted to life on land. Right? We had mosses that had to live near water. We've got ferns that are able to maybe live a little bit further, but reproducing with spores, they still needed water in order to reproduce. They needed to have water on the leaves so that the spores could travel where they needed to go for fertilization. But with gymnosperms, now we have seeds, and that's going to allow these plants to live. They no longer need water for that process of reproduction. So they're able to move a lot farther from land and become very successful group of plants. But the most successful group of plants by far, certainly in today's world, right, in the modern world, are going to be the angiosperms or the flowering plants. Now, what they are also seeded plants, but they did some interesting things with their seeds. So these are going to be the flowering plants. And what's going to be really important about them is that instead of just having naked seeds like the gymnosperms, many of them are going to figure out how to surround their seeds with fruits, which make them much more attractive to organisms that can help them disperse their seeds so they can actually get their seeds greater distance from the parent plant. And then, of course, there are flowers. And flowers are all about sex. It's a way of performing sexual reproduction that is going to allow angiosperms to become hugely, hugely successful because now they're able to leverage the labor of other organisms, right? When you have a flower, that's a structure that's designed to attract pollinators. So now pollinators are going to move pollen, which is sperm, basically, around to fertilize other plants nearby. So things like bees, butterflies, bats, right? There are a wide variety of things that do pollination. Those are going to be part of the reason that angiosperms become so wildly successful. And today they're far the most speciose group of plants on Earth. And almost all the plants that any of us will ever draw are probably going to be angiosperms, unless you decide to get in and start and like focus on ferns or something like that. But if we're doing flowers, we're talking about an angiosperm. Now, it's great to think about the taxonomy of plants this way. No green algae, but let's think about them another way that's less taxonomic and maybe a bit more functional. That might be a great place for us to start when we're out in the wild, right, wandering around, and we want to start being able to identify what we're looking at. There's three basic categories that are going to be a great way to start separating out what kinds of plants are what in our minds. First of all, we're going to have the woody species, trees, vines, and shrubs, things that have a layer of rigid bark over the internal softer layers of plant tissue. And we're all familiar with bark, right? Think about a tree, the trunk of the tree, right? That's covered with bark. So those are going to be our woody species. On the other end of the spectrum are going to be a group that we're going to call graminoids. Graminoids are going to they're going to be much smaller with leaf blades that are generally elongated and flat. It's going to include our grasses and then rushes and sedges that have very similar growth patterns to grasses. So those kind of smaller plants, no woody bark, things like that, the graminoids. And then almost like an intermediate, are a group of plants that we call forbs, or herbaceous plants. And these are going to be broad-leafed plants, so not graminoids, not grasses, but they're not going to have woody tissue, at least not above the ground. And this is where most of our common sort of flowers, like a dandelion, would be considered a forb. You would probably consider a lot of the blackberries as being forbs. They don't really have a whole lot of woody growth on them. So a lot of the plants that are very common to us, irises, tulips, right, things like this, these are going to be considered forbs. So when we go out into the world and we're wanting to start to identify plants, first of all, it's good to get a good on a handle. Is this a tree? Is this a grass? Right? What is it? Then we want to start looking at the general characteristics that to be able to consider, right? First of all, the form or shape of the plant, right? What does its silhouette look like, sort of from afar, right? Does it have a round or an oblong shape? Does it grow upright into a hedge? Does it spread, right? That sort of thing. Plant size, how big is it? Is it a few inches tall, or is it 30 feet tall, somewhere in between? Where the plant is growing is also going to give you a lot of clues to its identification. Is it in your yard? Is it in a field, a wooded area? Is it growing on a beach or in a wetland? Is it up at a higher elevation, or is it down here closer to sea level? Those sorts of things. Because when we start getting into the nitty-gritty of plants, we're going to find that a lot of identification can happen just based on where we are, where we see the plant. With the caveat that I'm talking here about plants that are wild growing, right? This is not, anybody can plant a huge variety of things in their garden that are not native to that area. So when we're thinking about natives, it's really what we're talking about here in terms of site characteristics. But once you get into identifying them, you'll find in field guides where there are going to be range maps for plants. And so you may be somewhere and say, oh, well, I think this is this species of blackberry. And you look at the range map and realize, oh, nope, that's not the one that grows here. I think it's this other one instead. So those types of things, that geographic location and environmental conditions, hugely important. If it is a tree and does have bark, the characteristics of the bark can be important. Is it smooth or is it rough? Does it have a flaky texture? Is it one single color? Is it multicolored, right? Things like that. Does it change seasonally? So these are all going to be the sort of first questions that you're going to want to ask yourself when you encounter a plant and you say, what is this? These are the kinds of questions to start asking yourself, because it's going to start to get you pointed in the right direction. Now, let's talk a little bit about basic anatomy of plants. We're going to get some terminology here so that when we can talk about some of these features. One of the really, fundamental parts of a plant are going to be leaves, and leaves can be very useful in identification. Maybe not quite as useful as flowers, except that a lot of plants have leaves for more of the year than they have flowers. And that becomes important. So when we look at a leaf, the main part of the leaf is going to be something we would call the leaf blade. And there's going to be this midrib and petiole that are going to attach down to the stem. So there's a stem, and then the leaves are growing off of the stem. And so some of the things that we're going to look at is, how are those leaves attached to the stem? What does that look like? That can be important for identification. We can also look at the veins, right? The veins and how they're organized on the plant or on the leaf. And then, do they have venules that are going to be branching out even yet again? And another feature of the leaves that's going to be important to us is the margin, right? What does the leaf look like all around its edge? Is it smooth? Does it have teeth, right? What is it? Is it lobed? What is its condition? These are all going to be things we're going to start to look at in order to help us identify things. So, a couple of things. Let's leaf arrangement. That's a little easy to get our heads around. When we think about how a leaf is attached to its stem, really simple. Is it opposite? Will two different leaves attach at exactly like the same location or the same place? Oh, I'm getting unconnection. I hope my internet's okay. Whatever. I'm going to keep going. Where we get these, are they attached opposite, or do they alternate, right? Are the leaves staggered in how they attach? Another thing to get your head around is whether or not, for broadleafs, whether they are a simple leaf or a compound leaf. Now, this is one that sometimes people find a little bit tricky to understand, but basically a simple leaf is just a leaf that is not divided in any way. It might have some lobes around the edges, but it's just that leaf. It's one midrib and petiole that is attached to a stem, and that's the whole leaf. That's a simple leaf. We contrast that with a compound leaf, where we still have this midrib and petiole situation, but instead the leaf is separated into leaflets that are attached to the middle vein, but have their own stalks. So if you find something that has its own stalks, but then not attached to a stem, you're looking at a compound leaf. Radishes are a pretty common plant that have leaflets. They have compound leaves. It's kind of annoying. There are some plants that we could look at that, there's Carrie. There are some plants that we could look at that sometimes some of their leaves can be simple, and other times they can sometimes have compound leaves. California blackberry is like that. You can see both of these kinds of leaves on the same plant at times. But being able to get your head around a simple versus a compound leaf is a good thing to learn to identify. A little bit more about leaves. I'm going to go through some of this stuff pretty quickly, because this isn't something for you to try to memorize right now. You'll be able to look at the slides and look at some of these identification resources. But basically, what is the overall shape of the leaf, right? Is it lanceolate, long and thin? Is it ovate, where it's kind of an oval that points at the top? Maybe it's obovate, an oval that points down near where it attaches to the stem, right? Star-shaped, heart-shaped. We can look at the tips of the leaves, right? How do these leaves end? Are they acuminate, where they have a very, where they sort of are going to go gradually to a point? Do they have an acute, very fine point? Maybe they're completely rounded. Leaf margins also going to be very important to us because this is going to be a really good diagnostic characteristic for a lot of plants when we look at the leaf margins, and we're going to be able to exclude a lot of species based on, well, no, we know those have smooth leaves, and my leaf I'm looking at has serrated leaves. And many plants have leaves on them most of the year, which makes this probably more reliable than trying to count on being able to identify flowers. So we've got things where the entire leaf margin is going to be smooth. Maybe it's got sort of these small, perfectly uniform teeth. We could look at things that are toothed or serrated, that have kind of like a serrated knife blade edge on them. Something that's doubly serrated, right, where the serrations are going to be kind of a long one, short one, long one, short one. Is the leaf very flat and smooth, or is it sinuate or wavy? Does it have lobes, right? Like a lot of oak leaves have lobes. So these are some of the things we want to start to be looking for when we are trying to identify plants. The next thing we want to do is talk about flowers. When a plant is in flower, this is often going to be the best and easiest way to be able to narrow down your identification. Some things are still pretty hard to for sure nail. One of the things that we find here in Sonoma County is California poppies, very familiar to us. But there actually is another species, the tufted poppy, that looks a lot the same, and you really kind of have to look at some structures underneath the flower to make sure that you're identifying it correctly. But what I'm going to say about that is that I don't think that any of us need to really worry or be overly concerned with trying to identify every single thing that we see to species. The reality is that we won't and we can't, and that's okay, right? The more that we get into this, the more we learn the individual plants that are in our neighborhoods and that we encounter, we're going to get to know them, and we'll be able to identify a lot of them, and others we won't, and that's fine. But when we think about flowers, these are great ways often to identify plants because oftentimes their flowers are very distinctive. The only problem with using flowers to identify plants is that flowers are usually not present for most of the year, right? A plant may only be in bloom for a few months, maybe even a few weeks or a few days. So we might have a little bit of a limited window on this, but we can, sort of get used to it, learn our way around a flower, right? We've got the stigma, the style, and the ovary collectively are going to be a structure that is called the pistil. This is the female parts of the plant, right? This would be where the eggs are going to be located. We also then have the anther plus the filament. That's going to be the stamen, which is the male part of the plant. Of course, we have petals that are modified leaves. We have sepals that are similar to petals. And sometimes there's not really much difference between the sepals and the petals, but these are all modified leaves that are providing sort of the base of the flower. We can then start to look at some other aspects, right? What is the symmetry of the flowers that we're looking at? Are they radial? Where the flower is, you could cut it sort of at any axis and it's going to be, sort of symmetrical that way, kind of thinking about like a wheel, like a wagon wheel. That's going to be radial symmetry. Lots of flowers have radial symmetry, but many of them don't. We also have bilateral symmetry in some flowers, and that's going to be a good thing to try to identify. That's going to help us figure out what kind of a plant and flower that we're looking at. So when we're talking about flowers, the other thing we want to talk about are inflorescences. So an inflorescence is going to be a group of flowers. It turns out that sometimes you're looking at a flower, what you think is a flower, and it's a flower. It's just, here's one flower, that's what you've got. But a lot of times plants are going to flower in ways where they form inflorescences, where are these collections of multiple flowers, sometimes hundreds of tiny flowers all together that are making up kind of the structure. So things like, and these are just a few of the different shapes of inflorescences. We've got these things called catkins that kind of hang down, and these on this like willows and some other kinds of plants, right? We've got this umbel, like kind of almost like an umbrella shaped inflorescence. Those are going to be really common in the carrot family, for example. A raceme and a spike, where we've got, sort of things that are growing on sort of a longer spike. Things like composite flower, where here this look a flower, but if you look at the middle, there's actually a whole lot of little tiny flowers that are blooming in that central area. So being able to understand what the inflorescence looks like can be really important. Here's another thing that's gonna be a sort of a little bit more schematic view of some of the types of inflorescences. There's two general categories, these racemose or indefinite ones, where the main axis keeps growing continually. Newest flowers are at the tip. We've also then contrasting with cymose or determinate or definite growth, where the main axis terminates in a flower and the old
Is everybody having, this is different. I don't know what I'm seeing is my problem or everyone else. Can you?
No, we're all in the same boat. This happened.
Okay,
She's run out. Carrie,
she's
she's run out of power. She's
Well,
running
she's
out.
coming back again though. She's coming back in, so.
I really want, I need to share my screen.
All right, so you had to go out again, so
Can
I've
you
got to
not
make
hear
you
me?
co-host. Yes, I can hear you,
Okay,
but I need to make you co-host
okay,
again. Hang on a sec, I think, so you can share your
perfect.
screen.
Yeah, no, I just got kicked out. I think it's just because I'm on a hotspot on my phone that the internet is
Right.
not that great.
Yep.
But yeah, I could maybe turn off my camera. That's a good idea. Let's see. Turn off my video. Okay. Yay. Okay, we're gonna keep going.
Looks good.
See how this goes.
But we only have about
Let's see.
50.
So we were looking.
Good. Wendy, before you go on, are you willing to stay on a little bit
Yeah.
longer considering, and so for all of you, we're gonna let her go with the presentation
Yeah, I'm fine.
until 6, and then she will stay around for questions and answers. I'm sorry if some of you have to leave, but technology is throwing another curve at us.
I'm
So
totally fine with that.
great. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm fine with that. Okay, so yeah, so we'll just move on. So thinking about the shape of inflorescences, that's going to be useful. Fruit is another thing that we can use to, rather than going through the different types of fruit here, again, for the sort of the interest of time, we can just, the fruit is going to be, the way that the fruit is configured, a lot of it has to do with like how it's generated out of the plant. Is it from a single flower? Is it from multiple, where there's multiple flowers that contribute to the fruit? We can add accessory fruits, things that develop from something other than the ovary of a plant. So when fruit is present, that's going to be a great thing to look at to try to identify the plant. And seeds, another thing that's really, really helpful for us when we're trying to identify plants. When they have seed, then that's something we can look at and often figure out what kind of a plant it is from that. We've got things like seeds that come in pods, right? Capsules. This is something called an achene, rose tips, drupes, like a plum that has sort of like the things, a palm, like an apple. So looking at samaras, these are what we would find on maple trees. So looking at the seeds, the shape of seeds is also going to be a useful feature. Now, one of the things that we really need to recognize now, I've already said that we are not going to be able to identify all the things that we see, and that's okay. And one of the things that's kind of working against us in this is something called phenology. Phenology just means it's referring to the temporal cycles of things, right? The life cycles of things over sort of the course of a season, or even the course of sort of 24 hours. But we'll think about plants as having a very much seasonality to them, right? Where they're going to change over the course of the season, right? There may be times in the year when they're not growing at all. Other times when they're in a growth phase, sometimes when they're flowering and then setting seed, and other times when dropping their leaves. And plants can look very different during the course of a year. I've got 3 images here of the same type of plant, which hopefully you recognize. If you don't recognize this plant, it'd be good to get your head around it, because this is poison oak, which is a native plant. I love it. This is one of my favorite plants, actually, but that doesn't mean I want to rub it on my skin, because it can give us, and particularly people who are sensitive to it, can get pretty drastic rash. But, some of the time the leaves are green. They can be shiny, or they can be kind of matte colored. They turn red sometimes in times of the year. There are parts of the year when this plant won't have any leaves on it at all. So we want to just recognize that there are going to be times in the year when we won't be able to identify plants that we can identify if they have flowers, right? If they have seeds or fruit. And then thinking also about, like, is there a difference between the spring, summer, and fall colors of the plant? Now, these are some of the common plant families in California riparian habitats. At the end of this presentation, I do have some information about all of these families. I'm probably not going to have time to go through it today, but it's going to be in the slides, so you'll be able to review that. And then anyone who's coming to the preserve next week, we can definitely go and we'll be able to find members of most of these families on the preserve and kind of take a closer look at them. So now we've got, here we go. Sort of switching gears a little bit. But when you're going to be identifying things, one of the most important things you're going to need are some resources to help you identify the things you see, right? I've just given you kind of an overview of characteristics to look for. And now you want to find some field guides that are going to have keys, right? Some sort of an identification key. If you're looking at trees, the Pacific Coast Tree Finder here is a great little reference. For the vascular plants of California, the gold standard is the Jepson Manual. This is a book that's about 3 inches thick. So I know people who carry them into the field. I'm not one of those people, because this is a big book. But this is going to give you identification, like really being able to identify all of the plants. But it's going to go into a lot of details, even more detail than we talked about here today, about certain things like what's the position of the ovary on a flower, things like that. Right. And then there are other field guides. So figuring out some ways that you're going to be able to identify your plants, you're going to need outside tools. I have sent Margot a whole collection of different links and a PDF that can help you get it started in that right direction. But then I have the next question I have for you. What if you can't identify your specimen in the field? Well, what I'd recommend is that you sketch it with the idea that you'll be able to identify it later. So, a question that I often get asked is, why not photos? Right? I understand that before there was photography, we had to make illustrations, right? We had no other way of making a visual representation of something but drawing it. But now we all have a phone in our pocket pretty much all the time, or most of us do. So why am I suggesting you draw things instead of just taking photos of them? And there's actually quite a few reasons to that illustration is still very important to us, even in the age of photography. With drawing, I think to some degree, the most critical thing about drawings is the way that you interact with the plant as a result of making a drawing of it. When you look at something and you take a photo of it, you've looked at it for maybe 5 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, then you snap your photo and you move on. In order to draw something, you have to look at it for an extended period of time. And this is going to help you become much more familiar with its characteristics and notice things about it that you will not notice if you're just taking photographs. And then once we're talking about looking at botanical illustration, right, drawings allow us to illuminate things that we can't see in a photo. You're not ever going to see an oak tree that has both summer foliage and winter foliage at the same time, but I could illustrate it that way, right? We're not going to see plants probably that are in flower and setting seed, and we can see what the fruit looks like, and we can see the roots and all that kind of stuff. So illustrations, excuse me, allow us to see things that are just not visible in photographs. Especially if we think about Maybe we're going to do a dissection of a part of a plant and then blow that up into detail so we can really see what it looks like. And things like the life cycles of plants. This is actually a life cycle of a butterfly that's highlighted here. But we're not going to see all of those stages in one thing, but we can illustrate it that way. Now, the other thing I really want to stress here is that you don't have to be a great artist to be able to put things on paper in a way that can communicate to other people. If you pay attention to the morphological details, I very much believe that almost everyone who is capable of holding a pen or a pencil in their hand and writing out words is also capable of doing this kind of illustration. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is draw what you see. That's what I mean when I say pay attention to morphological details. Morphological details are just the way that it looks, the shape and the form. Draw what you see. So let me give you an example. If somebody says to me, hey, draw a tree, this is probably what I'm going to do first. That's a tree. Does that look like any real tree? Really, what that looks like is a symbol that represents a tree, because you can look at that and say, yeah, that's obviously meant to represent a tree, but I don't know that you're going to go outside and find a tree that actually looks like that. But what that is, that's how I learned to draw trees when I was very small, right? I was 3 years old and somebody says, this is how you draw a tree. So in part of my brain, that's what a tree looks like if I'm going to try to put my own hand to paper and draw one. But that's not really what a tree looks like. So what do we do instead? Instead of just trying to draw things the way that we think they look, or that we learned how to draw them when we were really young, what if we look at a tree? And then if we look at the tree and then we draw what we see, now we're moving in the direction of botanical illustration. This is no longer a symbolic portrayal of something, but it's actually, we're looking at structures and drawing the structures that we see, right? Just like with, maybe I want to draw this evergreen tree. We might think it looks like this sort of series of triangles on top of each other, but no, this tree has a definite structure of where the branches are coming off and their orientation to each other and what the foliage looks like. So we want to just get out of our heads enough to not draw what we think a thing looks like, and instead just look at something and draw what we see. That is the single most important thing in getting started in this kind of artwork. If you've not done a lot of artwork before, this is a great way to start getting your head around it. So, let me see. Margot, what time is it?
It is 8:53. I'm sorry, 5:53.
Okay, I'm like, whoa, that went along.
Whoa.
Okay, I'm going to go through some of this because I think this is really useful for us in the general principles, but I do want to try to wrap it up by 6 o'clock, and then I will take questions. But some general principles, especially if you're kind of new to drawing, right? A way that I recommend starting is by blocking something in. That's where you identify some large geometric shapes that are going to help you with your composition and your scale. So here I've got a large shape that's kind of the whole overall silhouette of the plant. And then I'm going to look at the sort of the overall general shapes of each of these different petals because they all have a different shape. We can then look at things like angles that we find within parts of whatever we're drawing. Sometimes it's hard to get your head around what is this actually shape that I'm looking at, and it's useful to look at negative space. The negative spaces can help reveal the form of something in order for you to draw it. And the other thing that's nice about negative space is a really good exercise to do to get the practice of drawing what you're looking at instead of drawing something that you think is the way it's supposed to look out of your brain, is by focusing on things like the negative space. Draw that shape. Don't try to draw this petal and this petal. Draw that shape. And that's going to start getting you to where you're getting proportions and things correct. Because remember, with botanical illustration, we want things to be accurate. We want the measurements of things to be correct. We don't want this to be impressionistic or sort of our strange interpretation. We want things to be accurate. So we are maybe even going to go in and look at relative proportions, right, in the plant. maybe actually measuring distances. It's not unusual to get up and hold a ruler to something and measure the actual distances, and then looking at how the different parts of the plant are aligned to one another. So I'm going to just show you a real quick of a way that I think is a nice place to start with sketching, right? Is when you start sketching, again, maybe block something in with some big shapes, and then start with really light, loose lines. Even let yourself be sloppy. And as you draw, you're going to go over and you're going to start to, the form is going to start to emerge. And then you get your first outline down and you realize, that's not really right. Here's the secret. Professional artists, almost all professional artists, it's not the first lines that you put on the paper that are the ones that make the final artwork, right? We are all working on this and sort of adjusting things as we go. So as you do this sketch, give yourself permission to go over it over and over again. And each time you have the chance to adjust things just that little bit much to make them that much more accurate. Let me just show you a little example of this, right? This is a time lapse thing. I don't draw this quickly, but right. So I blocked out a shape. I've now put in kind of the petals, and now I'm going to go over them a few times as I keep looking at the flower and then drawing what I'm seeing. Oh, see, I decided that one petal was too long, so I've adjusted it, right? I'm drawing what I'm seeing. And every time I go back over the lines, it gives me the chance to adjust something to make it just that little bit more accurate. Eventually, I'm going to decide on the final lines and clean it up. No, don't play again. Just come here. There we go. And decide on the final lines, right? And this is pretty sloppy. This is not a fully rendered drawing, but that was my process to get from this thing and having a drawing of that flower that's in proportion, where the parts of it are in proportion to themselves. Now, what this drawing that I've done here is something that's called a contour drawing. And this is something we can talk about briefly, looking at styles, right? Are you going to do a contour drawing, or are you going to do something that has some shading? For a lot of botanical illustration, contour drawing is great. This is an example of a contour drawing that was done by one of my students. And then this is something that's more shaded, that's maybe more realistic, but neither one of these is better or worse in terms of the representation of the plants. So be thinking about that. And when you're starting out, contour drawing is a great way to go and to approach your artwork. Adding color then is another thing that you can look at. I would say start off monochrome, start out with outlines, black and white and gray, and then start moving into color as you get more comfortable. We also think about artwork on sort of a spectrum from the technical to the expressive. Now, in this sort of botanical art illustration world, we want to focus more towards the technical, but that doesn't mean that it can't also be aesthetically pleasing. Here's a botanical illustration of Doug's iris, which is a species that's native here, and we can see they've drawn a lot of different parts of the plant in great detail. This is a portrait that I did of a Douglas iris, and I was really more focused on aesthetics. It's accurate. It was drawn from a real flower that was growing on the Sonoma State University campus, but I've not really highlighted particular structures, right? So this is more expressive. Let's look at some other examples, right, of technical. We can look at water lilies, where here's a very detailed botanical illustration that has details of variety of different plant structures. Or we can look at something that's still very realistic, but more in this botanical art category. And then we find people going more impressionistic, more expressive, right, as we go. All of these are equally appealing or equally useful or valuable as works of art, but they may have a different purpose, right? Different kinds of expression versus a botanical illustration approach that's going to really try to be very scientifically accurate. Sorry, Monet, but your water lilies might be not quite the most scientifically accurate ones imaginable. Doesn't mean they're not beautiful. Some finishing touches that I'm going to suggest that you do. Apologize that these aren't plant drawings. These are some of the best examples that I've done with doing a drawing, and that maybe you want to add some labels, right? First of all, I recommend giving all your drawings a title, even if it's just the name of whatever you've drawn. You may want to label structures on that drawing. If there's any question about what the size of your subject is, put a little scale marking in it so you can tell. But this is the one thing that I'm going to urge you to please always, every single time you do a drawing, always, 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 without fail, sign and date your drawings. If you're drawing in a notebook and they're all together, maybe just make sure your name's in the book, but always date your drawings so that you can go back and know when you did it. Sometimes I haven't dated my drawings in the past, and I'm always really annoyed with myself when I go back and I think, when did I do this? Yeah, I didn't bother to put a date. Oh, well, right. So I really urge you to sign and date your drawings, signing your drawings, because you want to take credit for the work that you did, right? This is something that you've done. You want to put your name on it, and then the date so that you can know when you did it. It's also a nice way to be able to kind of watch your progress as you go through drawings, and improve your skills. So I've got a couple of exercises that I would recommend to you. Let me just talk about them now. I'm not going to have us do them right now, but first exercise is kind of an idea of trying to get you out of your head when you're drawing. When we're drawing from nature, like doing observational drawing, like what we're talking about today, you should probably be looking at your subject about 70% of the time and only having pencil on paper and drawing your subject about 30% of the time. So to try to get you out of your head, what I like to have my students do is draw this flower a couple of times. And the first time, put the paper to one side and then draw the flower without looking at your hand or the paper at all. Like look down to see with your pencils in the middle of the paper, and then just look at the flower and draw the flower without looking down at your hand at all. Now, what you're going to end up with is probably not something that your mom would have even posted on the refrigerator when you were small, but it's going to give you this sense of, I can look at the thing and start to see it, because ideally, we probably want to stop thinking about, I'm drawing a flower. And instead, we want to think about, I'm drawing a collection of shapes. I am drawing something that has this sort of rounded, but not actually a sphere in the middle of it. I'm drawing this thing that has this shape. It's a petal, yes, but it doesn't have the same shape as this petal or this petal. So the more that you can think about what you're looking at as a collection of shapes, that helps you maybe not draw something that's very stereotypical or symbolic, like that first tree that I showed you. Another exercise, draw the flower again, and this time look at the paper so you can get things into proportion. But ideally, what I would love people to be working on, and we'll definitely be working on this next week at the preserve, is to find a plant that interests you and then work up a botanical study. So what I recommend is to do something that's going to show the overall growth pattern of the plant. Then you're going to do something that gives you the detail of a single leaf, including the arrangement of leaves on that branch. And then some other structure. Maybe it's the root, maybe it's a fruit, maybe it's a flower. And then, add to it, do some research and add to it some information that kind of fills out your knowledge of the plant. And this is what I would love to see folks working on, right? Doing some botanical studies. Outline or contour drawings are absolutely fine. And while ideally you're going to go out and walk around and look at some plants outdoors, feel free to use reference photos. Feel free to take your own photos and use those as a reference. But this is what I would suggest that, sort of be thinking about this. If you're coming out to the preserve next week, then we can be looking at this in more detail, and we'll be actually doing some of this work out in the field. But I would say play around with some of these concepts and work on a botanical study as a way to start dipping your toe into this world of botanical illustration. And I think I'm going to leave it there. I had a few more slides, but I think probably it's going to be good for me to leave it there based on the time and the situation that I don't know what my internet is going to do at any moment. So I am going to stop sharing, but I would be more than happy to hang around and take any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. I'm sorry for the technical issues, as I know you are too. We have a lot of programming coming up. Please hang in there if you have questions for Wendy, but I wanted just to let you know about some things coming up on our calendar, and I put the URL in the chat for you to look at, so you can look at what those programs are. Our next event is going to be the public hike up at the Osborne on Saturday, and then the next one after that is Wendy's field program. And if, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, if you weren't able to get into the program, on next Monday with Wendy and you'd like to, just email me, which I've also put that in the chat and it's on the calendar, and let me know you would like to join us, and I'll put you on the wait list and we'll see if we can make it happen. But anyway, so don't go away. Stay around. Wendy, please feel free to talk to people for another 10, 15 minutes. And if you'd like to ask questions directly, I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Or you can put them in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
Yeah, feel free to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and then come on mic. Whatever is going to work best. I'm going to try to put no, I'm not going to put my camera back on because I just realized it's dark in here. You're not going to be able to see me anyways.
Yeah, it's getting dark. Well, I had one question, which was, you talked about references and field guides and stuff. Well, what about some of the new apps that are out there? If you really are just trying to identify them, what do you suggest?
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah, I should actually talk about that and add that. Yeah, there are some great apps like iNaturalist. And in particular, iNaturalist has a product it's not the iNaturalist app, but it is it's called Seek. And basically you just zoom in on the plant and you take a picture of it, and it will help to get you in the direction of an identification. Yeah, that's a really useful tool. So I would say absolutely using all of these different types of tools, digital, like apps, whatever, books, everything that you can have is going to be useful. Use it all. Now, something like Seek, I have never used Seek, but I use iNaturalist a lot. And I find that iNaturalist for plants is a little bit hit and miss. I think it tends to do better with animals, but I think that's because a lot of animals and birds are a little bit easier to identify. But it's gonna get you in at least the ballpark where, well, is this a thistle or a clover or a whatever? It's gonna start to get you in that ballpark. And even if you can't identify two species, it's gonna move you in the right direction. So I would absolutely recommend using apps. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, Margot. I see that Madeline has asked what kind of materials we should bring. That's a really good question. And I'm glad you asked it. I probably should have included that in the presentation to start with. But I would say whatever you're going to be comfortable drawing with, probably instead of just bringing loose paper, it's probably nicer to bring some sort of a little notebook with blank paper. And it can be anything. It can be, sort of just regular sketch paper, or if you wanted to get something like watercolor paper, and then ideally a pencil and something to sharpen your pencil with. That is plenty. And if you maybe wanted to bring like a tiny, you can get those like little plastic rulers, like even like not a whole foot long, but like a little mini ruler. You might find that useful. I would say that would be a good basic set of things to start with. And then if you want to go a little further, you could bring a little field watercolor set, right? A lot of people like to do watercolor in the field. Like I said, I do all my art digitally, although I probably wouldn't necessarily bring my iPad. I don't always bring my iPad out into nature. I tend to photograph things and then draw from my photo references. So that might be another approach if you wanted to bring a camera. But I would say pencil and paper, that's going to be all you need. And then if you wanted to have some more things to kind of expand out and play with, you're welcome to do that. And watercolor would probably be a fun thing to do that with. Pen and ink, if it were me, I would probably wait and ink my things once I got home rather than inking something in the field. Yeah, that's a great question.
Are there other questions for Wendy?
Yeah, keep it simple is good.
I will be sending out an email later on this week with other sort of thoughts and directions and whatnot. So that will be coming to those of you coming next week. But please, while we have her, ask your questions.
Yay, thank you, Monique. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the irony is I deliberately made my way home after school because typically the internet on campus is very unreliable and my internet at home is so much better, but only when the power doesn't go out, which that I could not have predicted. So I apologize for, the internet and thank you. I'm glad that it was still able to be enjoyable and you were able to get something out of it. And, and Margot is going to send out a bunch of materials for you as well to look at. I've got some things like there's a great guide to oaks in California. There's a great guide to grasses. I will tell you, grasses, that's a whole nother world. I do not identify grasses. I look at it and I say, that's a grass. Maybe I can say that it's harding grass, maybe not. So, but yeah, there's going to be so many, there's a lot of resources. And so Margot's going to send you a list of some things that I found that I think are pretty good in terms of learning to identify things. Why
Wendy,
aren't you
were
going to join
amazing.
me in the field next week, Carrie? Where are you going to be, Carrie? You should be at Osborne. Rude.
Oh. Well, you were great, Wendy, and that was challenging. I don't see any more questions out there, so I'm going to let everybody go. And I hope
All
that
right.
many of you are able to join us next week. And as I've said again, please let me know if you'd like to come and you haven't been able to get in, and I will put you on the wait list. Okay.
Awesome. Well,
all
thank you,
right. Thank you
everybody. I
all.
appreciate your time. And yeah, and Margot has my contact information if there's ever anything that you want to go back and ask later. And yeah, I will
And
see
I'll
some
send
of you
that to
next
you.
week. Yeah, perfect. Thank you
Great.
so much.
Okay.